This happened 3 years ago, while a former relationship of mine was ending. I was 27 years old at the time. My ex-boyfriend and I weren't living together anymore. We were separated for a few months, but not quite broken up yet. I had just found out from his twin brother that he was keeping me as a backup while having fun with other girls. I decided to end things because of this. It was my birthday, and I was a bit emotional about this whole situation, so I decided to go to his place and end it properly face to face. I took an Uber driver there and went to the other side of town. It was very far away from where I lived, and in a not-so-safe-for-girls area. I got there and we talked, ended things on good terms given the situation, and now it was time to call an Uber to go back home. It was November on a rainy night, and we had talked for so long it was about 2 a.m. now. My ride came and I hopped in. I was looking out the window and thinking upon what had just happened. After 5 minutes or so though, I noticed my Uber driver was staring at me in the rear view mirror every second he could, whenever he could take his eyes off the road. I brushed this off at first. This wasn't the first time this had happened, and honestly I was too sad to care. But I started to notice that he was slowing down a lot. This is when I started to pay attention to my surroundings as well. I noticed that he was tall and very thin. He looked like he didn't take very good care of himself, and his car was actually pretty filthy. Out of nowhere, he started talking to me. "You are so beautiful." Thanks? What's your name?" I whispered my name after a long pause. "Wow, that's so sexy. I always wanted to have sex with a girl named my name." He continued to stare at me and started rambling without pause, clearly expecting reactions from me. "Do you have a boyfriend?" "Yes." "What a shame. I wanted you for myself. But I don't mind, you know. Let's go somewhere else. Come on, change the address in the app, 'cause I can't. Only you can. I know a place where we can go be alone and do some fun stuff." At this point, I started to pay closer attention to the route he was taking. I was almost ready to jump out of the car. The situation was getting pretty sketchy. "Are you going home alone? I could call it a night and go to your place, show you the kind of things I'm talking about." My heart was racing at this point. I actually did live alone. I decided to start recording him from here on, and couldn't think of anything else but to send the recording to my ex. "No, my parents are waiting for me." "Ah man, what the fuck? We can stay in the car though, I guess. Find a spot where it's dark." "No, I need to go home, I'm tired." "Come on, trust me. Where did I put that weed?" He started searching for something. My ex listened to this part and called me. I was so relieved when I saw my phone ringing. I answered and made sure the driver would hear I was on the phone with someone. He seemed to be very upset about my unexpected phone call, and now he had started talking to himself. My ex was furious, of course, but told me to say things out loud like where I was, when I would get home, other stuff like my mom was waiting for me. I ended the phone call and the driver asked me if that was my boyfriend. I said that it was, and he was silent for about 5 minutes. When he saw on the map that we were getting close to my address, he started asking me again to go somewhere or stay in the car with him. His speech was getting scarier, and he was getting more and more anxious that he couldn't convince me. He was turning around to fully look at me whenever the lights stopped. After what seemed like forever, we got in front of my building. I leapt out of the car and ran away. He called out that he wanted to come with me, but I entered the building and shut it behind me. I didn't turn on the light in the staircase because I didn't want him to see the block I lived in. I stood there in the darkness and peeked out the window just to see if he was gone, but he wasn't. I could see he was clearly observing the entire property, waiting to see exactly which light would turn on, aka where I lived. I couldn't even enter my apartment because I had left the lights on in my hallway and he would see that light shining through. I waited about 30 minutes before he finally left. I quickly entered my apartment and locked everything, but I didn't turn on or off any lights so it wouldn't seem like it was my home. I peeked out my window just to make sure he'd indeed left, but to my surprise he had suddenly reappeared. parked this time right next to the apartments. I was scared. I was scared out of my mind. I know that many would say I should have called the police at this point, but in my country, the police don't come for stuff like this. They barely show up in an hour if someone's getting beaten to death. He was just sitting there. Then I got a message from an unknown number telling me to come back down because he was waiting for me. I froze and cried. It was like my life was about to completely change just because of a 30 to 40 minute ride with an unstable person. I didn't even know how he'd gotten my number. From the Uber app? Did he buzz me when he arrived to pick me up? I couldn't even remember anymore. I didn't reply. He kept on sending me more messages. I remember one in particular that really creeped me out. He was asking me to at least come down and smoke with him, and I could hear his raspy breaths in smoking. He started calling me as well at some point, and eventually I blocked the number. I was afraid he would get angry and try to sneak into the building to find me. I was looking out the window from behind a curtain. I saw that after I blocked him, he kept on trying to call but couldn't. He started to smash his phone against the steering wheel, and finally, after 40 minutes, he left. I remained keeping watch for another 2 hours or so. Thankfully, he did not return another time. The next day, though, he did message and call from another number, but I blocked that one as well. He kept on trying for an entire year. I was extremely surprised he was so vigilant about it. I blocked all those numbers, and eventually I never heard from him again. I also never saw him in person or his car either. I reported everything to the Uber app, and I hope they took some measures. Honestly, I don't understand why nobody before me reported him. Unfortunately, living in London, I've been attacked a few times, but this was by far the scariest, and also the first. I was 8 years old at the time, visiting my grandparents who lived in London. At the time, I didn't live there yet, and I was just visiting for the summer. I was on a day outing with my parents and our visiting American friend. Let's call her Laura. My dad grew up in this area, so he wanted to take us sightseeing. We had done the Tower of London, Trafalgar Square. We were wandering through the Oxford Street area, just window shopping. I remember I was trailing slightly behind my parents for just a moment, looking into a busy cafe as I walked. It had a counter bar where 2 large ladies were perched on pedestals eating some ice cream. All of a sudden, I remember watching these 2 ladies fall to the side off their chairs onto the floor, almost as if in slow motion. It was like a dream sequence. I even recall the music from the cafe sounding like it was underwater and slowed down momentarily. Except they weren't falling to the floor. Actually, it was me. All I remember next is a huge shooting pain coming from my back and Laura screaming over me. I watched my mom sprinting away through the busy forming crowd, full of shocked faces, staring down at me with concern. My dad was on his phone. I remember being angry somewhat because mobile phones were new at the time, and he was always on his talking to work stuff. I later found out that actually he was calling the police. It took me a moment to figure out what actually happened to me. Well, I thought those big ladies were falling off their chairs. Actually, a homeless man in a heavy coat had suddenly come out of the crowd, picked me up by my collar, and slammed my head down into the pavement. My mom had immediately run after him, chasing him down a busy London street until he pulled a knife on her. Somehow, she and 3 men who were following managed to disarm the man and hold him down until the police arrived. It took around 2 minutes. In the moment it happened, I had no recollection of being attacked. I was excited to ride in an ambulance actually and a police car, and to get the experience of going down to the station. I asked to see a cell, and even remember getting a pen by a police officer. I was in a lot of pain, but I couldn't understand why the paramedic was fussing over me so much. Boy, when the adrenaline wore off, it sure did hurt quite a lot. It's amazing how a child's mind works when it's trying to protect you. As a side note, I did wake up screaming for months every night after, saying the man had snuck into my room, according to my mom at least.
I only remember that happening once. In fact, I had a cracked rib, giant black bruises all over my chest, and bruises all over my back from the viciousness of the attack. Later in life, I remember his face quite clearly. It's almost amazing that I didn't remember in the moment just how high he'd picked me up to slam me down. The memory was triggered by receiving birthday bumps as a teen, and it all came rushing back in the most bizarre way. I later found out that the man had in fact been using that large knife for a long time to murder other homeless people at night, and had attacked a few little girls in public as well. He'd always gotten away though. The police had been looking for him for months. It just so happened the dude hadn't counted on my mom being so fearless. He was put away that very same day, and I had to go to therapy for a few years to figure out just what went on. When I was in college from the ages of 16 to 20, I came into contact with a tutor at my college. His name was Jonathan, and he taught biology at my school. At first, he treated me rather normally, but as time went by, I started to notice things about him that would unsettle me. It started when I'd be sitting in class working or whatever. I'd look up to see him just staring across the room at me from his desk. If I looked at him, he wouldn't look away right away. I'd look away first, then back, and he'd be looking at something else. It used to make me feel uncomfortable, so bad I would purposely go for help with assignments to other tutors. Another thing he would do was constantly mark my assignments and leave the message, "Come find me." He would always do this under the simplest mistakes, even a missing comma, rather than just writing what I needed to add to the assignment. This forced me into interacting with him. He'd always turn the topic of conversation into something else. When I mentioned it to my only friend, she told me he was just being friendly, but I always felt so intimidated by this friendliness. She began to joke I must have had the hots for him, so I stopped telling other people what was happening. When I used to sit on the grass near the campus lake, I would use that time to play my Nintendo Switch. One time when I was playing, I felt a presence at my back and snapped around, only to see him sitting at a picnic table alone staring at me. I felt unsettled by this too, of course. I got up to leave. He shouted at me and said we needed to talk about some assignment. I asked him how long he'd been sitting there. He told me he'd just gone outside to think moments ago and hadn't realized he was looking at me. He went on talking about how our assignment was worth extra marks or something. He told me he noticed I didn't seem to have many friends and asked if I had a girlfriend. I lied and said yes, then said I needed to leave. After that, it was very obvious to me that he was watching me, but I found him very creepy and didn't know who to tell. I made a Reddit post and people said I was probably making something out of nothing, blamed my anxiety and told me to get therapy. I tried to just dismiss it as me being paranoid. Whenever I was at college though, I would see him everywhere. I'd look over in the library only to see him watching me. Outside in the courtyard, I'd see him following me behind a building. It made college into a nightmare for 4 years straight, and I had nobody I felt like I could talk about it with. I remember one situation where he taught a lesson about how livestock animals are artificially inseminated. Without going into graphic detail, he started talking about milking them for their seed with a gloved hand. Nothing out of the ordinary for that type of class. We were given assignments like that as part of our course anyway. Jonathan, though, said he had marked my assignment for something and I had to wait for it at the end of the lesson. When everyone else had left the room, I went up to his desk to grab it. When he handed it over to me, I noticed he was wearing a single glove on one hand and gave me an eerie smile. I got creeped out and left. Didn't ask anything, just left the room. I was worried nobody would believe me about how weird he was being. When I graduated college, he sent my whole class friend requests on Facebook. I didn't accept, of course, but for a long time he continued to just delete and resend the request all the way up till I blocked him. At one point, I got a random text from an unknown number saying we needed to talk, and he had uncontrollable feelings for me. I knew who this was, of course, and blocked the number right away. He was so obsessed with me, he bought a house on the same street as me and bought a dog so he could walk it and run into me whenever I walked my own. He tried to make it look like an innocent coincidence, but I knew he'd been doing this just to get close to me. To avoid him, I started going on late-night walks at 2 a.m., thinking I would be safe because he'd be asleep, only for him to approach me in the street out of the darkness. I told him to leave me alone and called him a stalker. He apologized for the way he'd been acting and begged for a second chance. I'd never even given him a first one, though. I went home, and I became certain he might try to kill me. And that's when I told my parents, who contacted the police. They couldn't do anything about it, though, because I had no evidence of any of these situations taking place. It was at least on record now. My parents started paying towards rent, so I could live in a different area to feel safer. Well, wouldn't you know, as soon as I left to rent in a different city, he sold the house he'd bought and bought a new one in my exact same city. I then moved and started renting somewhere else, and he was stuck with this house he'd bought this time. Even to this day, I feel like I have to keep looking over my shoulder. I'm not a very tall guy. I'm only 5 feet. He's over 6.5 feet tall. He's very intimidating, and every time I see him, chills run down my spine. I'm too scared to even have an online dating account anymore. I'm planning to move country soon, so I can be rid of him once and for all. I won't say where I'm moving just in case he finds this. I doubt he would, but better safe than sorry. This happened 5 to 6 years ago. After meeting up with a couple of friends who were stationed near the bar, my friend Robin and I decided to end our girls' night early, at around 1 a.m. or so. I'm horrible with street names, so bear with me. We went to Rocket Bar that night, so you can know it was near there if you know that place. We hopped in a car and started pulling out. We were driving a bit slow because we weren't very familiar with the area, and we didn't want to get lost or miss any turns late at night. I had my window rolled down a bit, because when I drink I can get a bit flushed. The street we were on was completely dead at this moment. We heard a yell out of nowhere, and some loud-ass crying as well. It was clearly a woman's voice, so we slowed the car down to try and see what was going on. Robin was driving, and I was in the passenger seat. On our right side, we saw a lady stumble out onto the street, holding her chest and sobbing. Robin locked the doors and cautiously rolled my window back up, leaving only an inch or so open. The lady stumbled right up to my window and said, "I need help." I asked her what was wrong. She just kept on repeating she needed us to help her over and over. Me, being a naive idiot, I put my hand on the door like I was about to open it, only to be grabbed firmly by Robin. She whispered in my ear, "Don't you dare fucking open that door." The woman kept on mumbling "I need help" repeatedly, like she was slurring her words together. As soon as she saw Robin stop me though, her eyes opened wide as hell, and she started screaming. We jumped up and said, "What's wrong? What do you need?" At this point, she shoved her fingers through the cracked part of the window and screamed to let her in. We started yelling at her to go away. The lady started yanking at my door handle. Robin said hell no, and we started to pull away. The next 30 seconds was the most terrifying part. All of a sudden, the lady called out into the night, "They're leaving!" We saw a bunch of people run out from a car parked a few cars behind us on the right. Robin sped away like a scene from an action movie. We looked into the rearview mirror and saw there were 4 people standing in the street now. Ladies and gentlemen, please be careful. I can't imagine what would have happened to my dumb ass if it weren't for my friend. I know it's in some of us to want to help, but there are a lot of evil people out there who disguise themselves to do us harm. Be aware of your surroundings and lock your doors in DC. When I was 15, I traveled with 2 friends who were both 15 as well. We took the train to get to an event a few hours away from where we lived. We were all interested in working in healthcare and went to a what it's like to work in this field event in another city. After the event ended, we didn't have long to get to the train station to catch our train home. We had pre-booked for a taxi from the venue straight to the station because of this. This was before the days of Uber, mind you. When the event ended in the evening, finishing slightly late, we rushed out to find our taxi, who must have been waiting for us. We approached one that appeared to be waiting for someone specifically. We had seen the driver turning away other people for a while. I called out to him, "Excuse me, is this the taxi for my name to the train station?" The taxi driver said yes, so we all quickly jumped into his car. After 10 minutes of driving though, my friend got a call from the taxi company saying our pre-booked taxi was back at the venue, still waiting for us. We realized this was not our taxi. I asked the driver to turn around, only for him to glare at me. "No, I'm not going to do that." He locked the doors right there and then. We started protesting, telling him to stop, that he wasn't our driver. He had lied to us that it was our taxi. Of course, he refused. My friend panicked and started hyperventilating. We thought he was going to kill us. Maybe that was an overreaction, but we were young and far from home in a dangerous situation. He started screaming at us that he wasn't going to let us out. We were in his car now. Eventually, I threatened to call the police, at which point he braked sharply and told us to get out right now. He left us on the side of the road and sped off at 90 miles per hour. The road was completely deserted. It was a dark winter evening, and we were all pretty freaked out now. My friend called the booked taxi, and thankfully they picked us up and took us to the station anyway. We didn't manage to get the fake taxi's number plate or any information from the car. In retrospect, I don't know if he really meant us harm. Perhaps he just wanted to scalp the journey and get paid instead. But we were 3 young 15-year-old girls far from home. He really panicked us by behaving so aggressively and locking the doors. Now in my mid-20s, I always carefully check the number plate on the Uber app to make sure it's the right car.